Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Hello, and on today's episode, I'm talking to Andrew Norton, who is Professor in the Practice of Higher Education Policy at the Australian National University and quite clearly an all-round expert on higher education. It's wonderful to have you here at Melbourne Uni, Andrew.
Thanks, Georgina.
And we're going to talk today, of course, about higher education for our listeners' benefit. It's worth reflecting that Robert Menzies' reforms to higher education, particularly in the 1950s, led to a real education revolution in Australia, a tripling of the number of students enrolled at universities through the Commonwealth Scholarship Scheme and a doubling of universities in Australia through changes to federal funding. And he was deservedly proud of his achievements in this area of higher education, and it's worth reflecting on them and whether he got things right, things wrong, and where we are today. So looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you.
So tell me about Robert Menzies' approach to universities, because it was quite unusual and distinct for its time, wasn't it, in terms of his philosophy around the university and the purpose of education?
Yeah, so Menzies was a very talented scholarship boy who attended Melbourne University around the time of World War I. I think this was a transformative experience for him, and I think very much shaped how he saw the university in probably the world society, but in particular in Australian society. And I think the distinctive feature was his very strong emphasis on sort of the higher purpose of universities in improving your moral character, not just improving your ability to do a job as a lawyer as he became, or a doctor, or some other professions that were in the universities by that period in the early 20th century. Even though that's always been a thread of thinking about higher education here and overseas, in Australia, I think there has been, right from the start, a more utilitarian approach to it. Unlike most of the universities in Europe, our universities were established by governments and not by churches or other private entities. And so there was always this practical element to them. And of course, the universities are starting in the 1850s when Australia is a new democracy. The colonies are new democracies. And I think, again, you've got that influence. We're just starting to see the beginning of a time when people expect government to deliver them services other than defence and policing. And so there were democratic, I think, expectations around it as well. And I think this has been a central tension between probably what academics want to do, which is kind of pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, what people like Menzies believe, that this is kind of morally uplifting, and then what the students probably want and the government probably wants, which is simply more doctors, lawyers, etc. And I think Menzies was pushing back against that in his personal view of universities.
So do you think Menzies' idea of the university was much more coloured by a European idea of a university that did come out of theological, religious underpinnings in the, when was the first university?
About 1,000 years ago.
1,000 years ago, yeah. It's the 10th century.
And it's kind of interesting that universities in that time kind of created their independence from government, which was kind of respected. And we tried to carry that over when they became public institutions in Australia. And I think that's always been an interesting tension between universities as self-governing bodies, but at the same time as public institutions. And so we don't see that in government schools. We don't see that in vocational education, but we do see it in universities. And when government tries to overstep these boundaries, there's very strong pushback against it in a way there simply isn't in the other sectors.
Although one thought occurs to me, it's sort of like the ABC. So it's owned by the government, it's funded by the government, but it's independent of the government. And there's always a massive pushback if the government tries to direct the activities of the ABC or tell the ABC that it's biased. Sort of every government, I guess, seems to think the ABC is biased against it. And sometimes that's true, sometimes it's probably not. But that sort of tension that a government is funding a public institution to be independent and separate of it, and it's going to, on occasion, do things that the government's not very happy about.
That's right, and this is where you get sort of the doctrine of academic freedom, which it really starts off not really the individual academic freedom that we have today. It's more the independence of the institution. And then in the 19th century, you start getting to the idea of the academics personally having some academic freedom, not just against government, but against the institution itself. So a second layer of claimed independence, which interestingly didn't really have a strong legal foundation until very recently, but was nevertheless always or nearly always respected in practice.
So traditionally, and this is not just thinking of Australia, but more internationally, universities didn't have a sense of academic freedom until the 19th century. Is that what you're saying? A theological college back in the 11th century, you wouldn't necessarily have a lot of freedom, but you were at least free from the influence of government, but perhaps...
And free from kind of the mundane realities of the world, like Michael Wesley in his recent book on universities talks about, the symbol of the cloister at universities, which is kind of this monastic type place away from the world and away from the need to, make money and things like that, which I think is kind of interesting, sort of showing the close parallels between the church and the universities in that regard, in their kind of their place in society. But, a religious scholar in a university 600 years ago would not have had the freedom to say, oh, let's be atheists. I want to advocate atheism.
Right.
Because that was outside,
Yes.
You were a scholar. You could have legitimate debates about what the Bible meant on something or what other
doctrinal
debates. Yeah. But you couldn't go totally outside that and say, well, actually all of this is nonsense and we should be atheists.
Sure. Okay. So there were some guardrails, if you like. So Robert Menzies has this sort of ideal of a university as a place of intense learning and scholarship for its own sake, and he sees it as something incredibly important to Australia's democratic ideals, because if you have educated people in our nation, then they're able to engage in democracy more fully. Do you think that universities in the 21st century live up to the ideals that Robert Menzies and others might have had for an Australian university?
Probably not. Look, I think in reality the utilitarian aspect has dominated. And there were other things that kind of also worked against that, which is that even though there are residential colleges, particularly at the older universities, the reality was that Australian universities became commuter campuses.
Yeah.
And so most students were never immersed in a community in a way that they might have been, or still are, in fact, in England often.
Is that typical, particular to Australia, or is that something that you're seeing around the world? I mean, I know Britain and the United States, people often go interstate to go to university. It's a rite of passage, as they say. But other places around the world, is there a sense that you go to university leaving the family home, or is it?
I think it's strongest in sort of the European influenced countries, and possibly because the rite of passage is kind of the modern decadent equivalent of kind of removing yourself from the world and immersing yourself in another community. But Australia never did that, which has its strengths, makes it a lot cheaper, for example, but nevertheless does change the experience for the students.
Yeah, and I think when you commute to university, your life is full of busyness that is not at the university. So a lot of students in Australia will work, or they'll have interests around their home and the friends they already had from school. So they don't necessarily hang around the university campus as they might once have 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago.
Well, I think it's, as you said, campus has become less dominant in their lives even over the last few decades. But I think Menzies even comments that even in the early 20th century, the University of Melbourne was called the shop by the students. It's kind of indicating that even then a lot of the students had this fairly transactional relationship with it, even though there was obviously, at least until relatively recently, a very lively intellectual community around the university.
So Menzies in the 1950s, and look, I mean, it's worth giving context here. Menzies didn't just suddenly come to the prime ministership in 1949 and say, I'm interested in universities, what should we do? He had an abiding interest in education and universities from quite a young age, actually. Even in his 20s, he was talking about it. But in the 50s, he institutes some policy reviews into higher education. And with these come some quite dramatic changes to the way the federal government supports students and universities in Australia.
I think we need to backtrack before he comes to office in terms of understanding how this was working in policy terms. The key point here is that education was one of the residual powers under the Constitution that went to the states. And therefore, as it was envisaged by the founding fathers, universities would have continued to be state entities funded by the states. But then we get changes in the fiscal arrangements, particularly with the abolition of state income taxes during World War II. And I think after that time, the states didn't really have the fiscal capacity to provide universities on a large scale, which is kind of what people expected them to have to do in the post-World War II era. Now, Labor had been interested in universities as well, but they were largely using the defence power to fund and control, to some extent, the universities during World War II. And then in 1946, there's a constitutional amendment which creates the power to provide benefits to students. And so this is one of the key foundations for later involvement in higher education. But interestingly, that benefits to students' power doesn't really create the authority to directly subsidise universities with grants. And so one of Menzies' innovations is this is, I think, one of the very early cases of tied grants to states from the Commonwealth. There were something going back to the 1920s where I actually think he was a barrister in one of the cases that established on the losing side that the Commonwealth did have the power to make these tied grants. But generally speaking, by the time Menzies was the Prime Minister, these were used fairly sparingly.
Right.
That there was still this greater respect for the original idea of the Federation, and that even though the Commonwealth was giving the states money, mostly it was not tied to a particular activity. And so Menzies used Section 96 of the Constitution to tie some money to universities or higher education more broadly from the 1950s. So in some ways, that's kind of an interesting development for him, that he's kind of willing to use this constitutional power in a way that is not really contradicting the Federation, but is maybe in tension with maybe the earlier views of the respective roles of the states in the Commonwealth.
So the Constitution's changed, and then Menzies comes in 49, and he's able to start tying grants to the states in order to force some funding of the universities. Can I just ask, it's a basic question, but you say the states weren't able to afford the universities. Why was that? Was that because universities were becoming already astronomically expensive, or were the states' revenue streams so limited that they could only focus on, I don't know, roads and schools? And
I haven't seen a really good study of the politics of the states around higher education, but the reality was that through the 1930s, they were cut brutally during the Depression. That was kind of their lowest point because the states claimed they couldn't afford it.
Right.
And then in the 1940s, they lose the income tax power that they once had to the Commonwealth. And so they're even more fiscally constrained. So whatever the precise political judgments being made in the states, the reality was the universities were not getting from the states and from their other income sources anything like what the universities say they need. And of course, one of the reports that Menzies commissions, that the Murray Review, has a very blunt assessment of how bad the physical decay of universities is and all the numerous deficiencies in how they were operating.
So what led to the Murray Review? Because this follows the Chifley government's instigated but completed Mills Review in 1950, and Chifley had done that prior to the change of government in 49. So we need to doff our caps to the contribution of Chifley here. But the Murray Review in 1957, I mean, that really changed things significantly for universities in Australia. But what led to it? Was it Menzies' individual passion, or was it a crisis?
I think there was a crisis, which the Vice-Chancellors were pushing hard as a crisis. They put out a document in the early 1950s, which is still available and still rather strangely reads quite similarly to many university documents today about their financial problems.
Yeah. I mean, universities always are in perpetual crisis, it seems. I mean, there's endless debates around university funding, and we need more, and it's unsustainable, and we're going to see a collapse. And
yeah, that is a persistent thing.
They seem to still be around, still doing pretty well.
One of my theories about this, which is not original, is basically it's called the revenue theory of costs.
Yes.
Which is that however much money you give universities, they will use it all, build the new costs into their expenditure structures. And of course, the slightest change to their revenue or unexpected cost, and they're back in dire straits.
Yeah.
Then you kind of bail them out and they build up their costs again. And of course, the cycle just keeps repeating indefinitely.
Yes, indeed. I totally understand that. I think the public service also has a similar reputation. But yeah, so what was this crisis in the 50s that led to the Murray Review?
Partly it was a byproduct of the increase in student numbers after World War II, particularly with all the Commonwealth Reconstruction scholarships. And so there were many more students than there had been, which really highlighted the inadequacy of the physical infrastructure. And there was a lot of criticism, as we have today, of a number of students dropping out and sort of the defective nature of university teaching. So another of these themes, it just keeps recurring through time.
But the stakes would have been higher to drop out then because your family was probably paying for it, weren't they?
Look, generally speaking, there were fees.
Yes.
But they were fairly low. Well, they varied between institutions, between courses in some institutions, but typically on sort of the reader, they weren't hugely expensive compared to what they are now, maybe equivalent of a few $1,000s a year. Of course, a lot of people had scholarships as well. But interestingly, there's not a strong emphasis in the 50s and 60s on the fee side of things.
Yeah.
It's more about what is the government
It wasn't a dominating theme.
It wasn't a dominating theme, no. So, but I do think that even if there had been a review of universities in the 1950s without Menzies as Prime Minister, if another person had been Prime Minister, it's very unlikely there would have been the very generous, significant increases in funding that happened as a result of this Murray review. And I think that the Murray Review kind of permanently, I think, altered the balance of power, balance of funding in higher education and sort of reached its culmination in the 1970s when the Commonwealth basically became the only funder of universities.
Was it politically popular? So we see after the Murray Review, of course, the introduction of Commonwealth scholarships, which led to something like 80% of students attending university.
Yeah, so there had been scholarships before,
yes.
But what that 1946 referendum did was put scholarships on solid legal ground, which didn't really exist before. Like, particularly once the people with kind of defence-based scholarships had gone, it really wasn't clear the Commonwealth had legal power to actually provide these scholarships in the first place. And so one of the reasons you do get scholarships as a form of funding is that this is the clearly legal way of doing it that would survive a High Court challenge if anyone made one.
Yeah. And was it received very well by the Australian public? I mean, was it popular? Did people talk about it? Can you see in the media?
I haven't done a careful media check on this, but my perception would be that higher education, even now, is not a top of mind issue. And I suspect it was probably still the case then that the Menzies view of universities was probably not the mass view. And that also explains why I think another Prime Minister probably wouldn't have responded so strongly to the Murray report, because they would have judged that they're not going to get a big political payoff from this.
Because it would have been seen then, as it is now, as a domain of the elite. Is that why?
That's right. And I think this is also interesting in thinking about it from the Labor side.
Yeah.
Because I think one of the interesting aspects of Australian history is that it's really not until the second half of the 1960s that Labor really commits to this idea of free higher education, whereas its equivalent parties in Europe had often committed to that idea in the immediate post-war era. And I think this has something to do with the particular nature of Labor politics in Australia as a working class party rather than a broader social democratic party at the time. And also this long period where they took the view that the wage system should be the primary mechanism for providing adequate living standards, and the welfare state was going to be a more residual institution to pick up the people who couldn't, for various reasons, work. And that, I think, creates a system in Australia where you retain this kind of public-private hybrid system where there's contributions from both, taxes are kept relatively low. And so Labor is not pushing in this time, I think, for a large-scale free higher education system, even if some individual Labor politicians were starting to think that way. So I think this also affects the political dynamic of it.
So it's not until you say the end of the 60s that you get Labor starting to talk about free higher ed, but you're seeing that across European countries, that social democratic parties of the left are pushing for state-funded university.
As part of a general push towards more universal public services. So it's my general view of how higher ed funding works around the world is generally it integrates with the broader tax and social service system in each country. And so the European countries that have very high levels of social service provision and consequent higher taxes tend to have free or very cheap higher education. Australia's kind of in a mid-range where you've sort of got moderate level of government and public services. Then you've got some Asian countries where often there's very little support, public support for higher education, but typically quite low taxes.
So the Commonwealth scholarships were introduced because they could be, because they had a legal basis, as you say. I mean, what were the pluses and the minuses of these Commonwealth scholarships? Because we talk to a lot of Commonwealth scholarship recipients here. I mean, there's lots at Melbourne University, more senior older academics. And they talk about how transformational that opportunity was for them.
It's kind of interesting. There's a disconnect between the psychology of some higher education policies and the reality. So we see similar things with Whitlam's free higher education from 1974. If you actually look at the participation rates in the free higher education year, they actually went down, not up. And that was partly because there was a big baby boom coming through and kind of wiping out some of the gains of the increased number of student places. So the heroes of increased participation are really Menzies, Dawkins and Gillard, not Whitlam. But nevertheless, you've got this psychological belief that this was transformational.
But isn't that one of the issues, and we're jumping ahead here, one of the issues of the Whitlam era free higher ed, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that it erased the extra support you got. So it gave you a free place, but the Commonwealth scholarships had given you a free place. And if you needed it, if it was means tested, you got some additional support for living allowances, whereas you didn't necessarily get that with the Whitlam policy. And so people were saying, I've had anecdotal experiences relayed to me where people were saying once the Whitlam policy was introduced, actually were worse off than under the Commonwealth scholarship scheme.
I'm not clear on exactly how the scholarships compared. What Whitlam did was he replaced the scholarships with a student income support system called TEAS at the time, basically the ancestor of today's youth allowance. And so for many people, this was a form of freedom. And the reason was a lot of these scholarships, particularly ones provided by state governments, as well as the Commonwealth scholarships, were actually tied to particular courses. And once people got this means-tested, needs-based TEAS welfare payment, they could actually choose the course they wanted to do. And you see that, for example, enrolments in teaching decline at this period because people were often doing teaching because that was a relatively easy way to get a scholarship. The Commonwealth scholarships were typically not tied to a particular course, so they had greater freedom. I guess the other big distinction there is that they were what we call merit-based. That is kind of academically competitive, whereas the Whitlams were needs-based regardless of your prior academic achievements. Maybe for that reason, a scholarship is a bit of an endorsement of you in a way that student income support is not. And
so did the dropout rate under the Whitlam scheme increase then if it wasn't so focused on abilities like the
I'm not sure whether it did. So a lot of these dropouts are kind of hard to, there's not good reliable data over long periods of time. And a lot of what they call dropout, and this is true of the system more until quite recently, a lot of these dropouts were people actually changing courses. So they weren't actually dropping out of the system.
Yeah.
They were just moving around and not completing the course that they had started. I guess another thing about the dropouts until the 1970s is that you didn't really need a degree to make your way in the world, except in a few occupations. And therefore, not acquiring a degree was not necessarily a fatal blow to your career aspirations in a way that it could be for later generations. And I think the dropout rate is now lower because the stakes are higher.
Absolutely. So what about the introduction then of HECS in the 80s? Because obviously once the Whitlam government fell and the Fraser government tried to grapple with winding back the commitments, but that wasn't as straightforward as you would have thought, was it?
No, so the Fraser government, they promised not to abolish free higher education in the 1975 election. Nevertheless, there was a cabinet submission a few months later suggesting maybe they should abolish it, but they made a judgment they shouldn't break the election promise. And so this was an idea that kept floating around. They did put up in legislation to introduce charges for second courses at one point about 1980, but that didn't get through the Senate. So really what they just did instead was basically freeze overall funding.
Right.
So the 1970s and early 90s kind of seen as a period of stagnation now because couldn't move on public funding, couldn't charge fees, and therefore universities were in a bad way.
But the Hawke government decided to introduce HECS, which is sort of an income contingent loan scheme. And we still live with HECS in its newer iteration, HELP, isn't it?
Yeah. So this is really a very interesting period.
Yeah.
This is going back to our discussion. There were still people on the Labor side who did not see why Labor was spending so much money on all these middle-class kids getting a free higher education. And so there was ideological resistance within the Labor government to the idea of free higher education. I think the majority of people were quite nostalgic, or not nostalgic, but supported it. But nevertheless, there was a group who did not like it. But really the key problem was that in the 1980s, you've got two things happening. One is you've got another baby boom coming through. And the second thing is that the year 12 completion rate goes from 30-something% to 60-something% in a decade. And as a result, you've got vastly more people who are, at least theoretically, eligible to go to university and will want to go to university.
And why did that completion rate of high school go up by so much? That's extraordinary.
I think the collapse of the teenage full-time labour market was a very large factor in that. But there was a general belief from governments that Australians needed to be more educated than they were. And that was pushing out a lot of policies designed to encourage people to stay until year 12.
Yeah.
Like the majority did not go to university at that point, but nevertheless, there was a strong push to increase 12 completion rates.
So that's extraordinary. So you're about 30% year 12 completion, and then you go to about 2/3 who do complete year 12. I mean, these days it must be in the 90s.
Well, it's more like the figures aren't great, but it's still sort of higher for women than men, but 70-something, high 70s, low 80s, that kind of range.
Yeah.
So there's still a significant minority who don't complete.
So we get to the introduction, though, of HECS by the Hawke government. I mean, why change it again? The financial situation was unsustainable.
So the government wanted to maintain balanced budgets, and they had to find a way of expanding.
Look back on those days with nostalgia, don't we?
You would indeed, yes. And they didn't even achieve it occasionally. And so the question is, how do you fund a substantial expansion in the university system without blowing the federal budget? And so the various proposals surrounding this, including means-tested fees, which had been done before. But a guy called Bruce Chapman, who's at the ANU, took this idea, which actually started with Milton Friedman in the 1950s, of a different version to what we had, but this idea that students are lent money and then repay according to their income subsequent to their studies. So income contingent loans. And so HECS was actually the first time that an income contingent loan system introduced on a national scale anywhere in the world.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And there had been a couple of smaller versions prior to that, but this was the first national version.
Oh, so we were the grand experiment.
Yeah, and many countries have actually copied our system, and that provided the money to help expand the higher education system.
And would you say, in the main, HECS has been a success?
I think it's very much achieved what it set out to do. Like, it's taken university participation from 15-20% of young people to more than 40%. And so it's definitely, from that point of view, did what it intended to do. Students are still protected from default in the sense that if your income goes down, you don't have to pay. Whereas in what we call a mortgage style system, say in the United States, there are flat monthly installments for 10 or 12 years, however long it is. And if you can't pay, you default and your credit rating is ruined. So it's really quite high risk for people in other countries on these mortgage-based systems. And so all those problems have been eliminated by income contingent loans. But I think the politics, though, have started to change on this because so many people now have a help debt. About 3 million people have a help debt.
Yes, on a population of 25 million, 26
Yeah, so it's
million.
a lot. And over their life course, many more people will have or have had a help debt. And so this is something which is now going into the lives of very large numbers of Australians. And the amount of debt has gone up enormously over the last decade, partly due to the latest wave of expansion of participation. And it's really, I think, starting to become a political issue, particularly because the loans, while they never had a real interest rate, they are indexed to CPI inflation, which, of course, as we all know, is quite high at the moment.
Yeah.
So this issue of indexation, I've been doing media commentary on this issue for more than 20 years. I don't think I had a single call about indexation until last year. And then all of a sudden, I'm getting non-stop calls. Like on the day that indexation occurred this year, 1st of June, I think I did 6 media interviews on it.
Yes.
More than I'd done in the 20 years prior.
So what I'm finding just in my personal circle, people are being advised by mortgage brokers, financial planners to actually take money out of their mortgage, pay off their help, and then they obviously have a greater mortgage debt, but the rate of that mortgage is less than the rate that they're going to be charged with help. So just clear the decks. Don't be subjected to the CPI increments and take your chances with the interest rate hikes, I guess.
Yeah. Look, it's a difficult judgment call. Yeah. I think this is kind of one of those latent issues that because we've been in a low inflation era for most of the time that we've had this loan scheme, we haven't had to deal with this problem before.
Yeah.
And probably if this inflation cycle keeps going, we'll really have to rethink it because I think the politics will start to become untenable.
So I'm interested in the philosophical positions of political classes in Australia when it comes to higher education. So Menzies is passionate about education, wants as many people as possible who are of ability. I mean, I think that's the important caveat with Menzies. He doesn't want just everyone to have a uni degree. He wants there to be this sort of elite intelligentsia class who can be the public servants, be the commentators, be the academics or the like, who enrich our democracy. But then there is this huge strain of utilitarian thought in Australia that really comes from a colonial era times, that sort of Benthamite. Like, we've got to make this work for the country. We've got to get the maximum possible benefit out of the dollars put into higher education. So we want jobs to come out of this investment. We want prosperity, research, commercialisation, all those sort of terms. You see that very much on the right of politics. But then on the left, there's that appeal too, but there's also that we should just have people educated more broadly, sort of almost irrespective of ability, but it's about making sure everyone's equal. So someone from a very working class background who might not otherwise have the opportunity to go to university, they can, and the people in private schools will go to university because that's the trajectory.
I think it's a difference of emphasis,
yes,
rather than, I think, a fundamental difference, because even though for fiscal reasons Liberal governments have capped spending, which sometimes has consequences for participation, they've never really launched a massive ideological attack on the whole idea of participation increasing. So they've kind of gone along with it. And I think this is consistent with kind of the aspirational logic. Maybe it's framed differently. Like in Labor, it's an equity logic.
Yes.
But on the coalition side, maybe it's an aspirational logic. And do you really want to tell parents that, no, your kid can't do what he or she wants to do? They have to do X instead. And I think that's not a message the Liberal Party has been that keen on advancing, even though there's always been a sort of a core of right-of-centre opinion, which says too many students, academic standards are declining, etc.
Yeah, yeah. So was Menzies a big outlier in the tradition of Liberal leaders and Liberal governments in his higher education policies?
My view is that certainly his kind of rose-coloured glasses view of what universities were doing and could do, I think, does make him an outlier. I think this is, again, sort of a different emphasis because he talked about providing the skills we need, etc.,
yes,
like all his successors did. But I do think that another Prime Minister at the time wouldn't have been as generous, either in money or rhetoric, about what universities were doing. And by the mid-1960s, he's kind of pushing a lot of this off to John Gordon. And Gordon was quite keen on universities doing useful stuff. And so his rhetoric was quite different to that of Menzies.
So after the Hawke-Keating years, we obviously go into the Howard-Costello years, and the signature Howard government education policy was the Backing Australia's Ability Policy, BAA. And I mean, that to me, when I read about it, that's emblematic of Liberal government's education policies. It was around innovation and economic contribution, that innovation is about turning Australian ideas into more jobs and higher wages. So that real narrative around the utilitarian outcomes here. So people will go to university, but they'll get a job and they'll earn more money, and Australia will be more internationally competitive, and that will lead to greater prosperity in the future, greater productivity, hopefully, too.
Yeah, I think that's a very strong theme of Liberal. Labor as well is interested in this, obviously, but I think my basic view is the modern Liberal Party takes a very transactional view of universities. Like some in the higher education sector say the Liberal Party is hostile. And on some of the culture war issues, that's probably true. But overall, what strikes me most is the transactional nature of it. And if they can see a good deal out of this, the universities can do quite well. So the increase in money back Australia's ability is an example. Probably the most interesting example of how Liberal policy is interact with higher ed is really around international students.
Yes, because that's aside from Colombo Plan, which was some numbers of international students, but not vast numbers like we see today. But the introduction of international students as a sort of revenue stream is, here in Victoria, it's one of the leading export markets.
So Labor is the party that actually deregulates this in the 1980s. But I think the key change was really in the late 1990s. Up until that point, international students were supposed to go home after they finished, but Howard let them stay. And for a while, it was actually pretty easy to get permanent residence just by ticking a few boxes and doing some of the right things. And so that really linked migration and international higher education much more closely than ever been the case before. And I think this is a key reason why the market booms in Australia. So even now, probably about 2/3 of international students say that migration possibilities are one of the reasons they have for choosing Australia. And it's Labor in sort of the late 2000s that sort of hauls it back a bit before relaxing again when they realise the consequences of breaking that link between migration and education. Now, for the Liberals, this is mainly about they're doing it not because they want to boost universities so much as they want the skills that these migrants bring. So again, a very transactional approach to migration. But nevertheless, I think this is a key moment in the history of higher education in Australia, which enables or encourages international students to come and typically pay fees that are much higher than a university would receive from a domestic student. And this creates unprecedented levels of prosperity for the universities.
In the end, this is a net positive for our universities in terms of their global rankings, isn't it? Because your rankings are based on research and publications in journals and the like. And so if you're able to invest more and more in researchers, you can get more and more published articles and your ranking presumably go up.
And Chinese students are even...
And go, I was never looking at the University of Melbourne before or Sydney or ANU, but suddenly, now they're, 28th in the world actually. That looks like a really attractive option. Oh, and a migration pathway too.
Yeah, so strangely enough, even though the Liberals are probably less interested in universities than Labor is, I would say their policies have probably shaped them more in that sense.
But one of the criticisms of universities these days is that they focus too much on chasing the international student dollar and not enough on creating a really rich educational experience for domestic students. And they're too corporate and multi-billion-dollar businesses around Australia. And they've sort of lost that kind of nexus with the Australian public and Australian young people that they're supposed to be nurturing and a wonderful transformative experience. And actually your university degree is pretty transactional. It's checking boxes. Then you graduate and off you go to the workforce, and you might not particularly remember those uni days as fondly as maybe your parents or grandparents did.
Now, I do believe that teaching is the second priority after research for Australia's universities, but we do need to keep in mind that if we look at, say, the student surveys of their satisfaction with teaching, these have actually improved over time rather than gone backwards, which is what you'd expect if this thesis you've just advanced was correct. And so the first of these, the course experience questionnaire, which was sent to completing students, like the first ones in the mid-1990s, only about 1/3 of students were actually satisfied with the teaching experience they'd had. So it was really low.
Right.
And that was a massive shock, I think, to the sector that realised that actually we need to do a lot better here.
Yeah.
And I think this goes back even further where, in my view, research but not teaching turned into a profession. That is something where there are kind of acknowledged standards that the profession should self-regulate around. And so in research, we get peer review and things like that to try and assure standards. But in teaching, that never really happens. And so my view, having been at university in the 1980s and observing since, was that it wasn't that things were uniformly bad. There were some fantastic teachers, but that was more a matter of their own personal interests and priorities than it was of a university or sector level commitment to teaching. But what we see through the 90s is many the universities and the sector trying to improve the student experience. So I think in some ways it's more professional, but I also tend to think it's probably less personal. One of the things that I've heard from academics is that because they've got much bigger classes under strong pressure to do research, they don't put the time into, say, nurturing an undergraduate that they might have in the past, because there's no real career payoff for them in doing it. And so probably the most able students are worse off than they were in the past, but probably the less able students probably do get a more structured, professionally organised class than they might have 20, 30 years ago or 30, 40 years ago.
But universities in Australia have obviously increased in the global rankings, but are they, in your observation over the last 20 or so years you've been looking at universities, are they better? Do you think the quality of universities in Australia is a lot better than
on the research side? I think it is. And so one of the dynamics here is that both our internal policies, which reward performance, and the global kind of rankings have really focused universities on weeding out weak performers and weak areas within their institution and focusing on the strengths. So I think on average, both the quantity and the quality of research has gone up. Teaching, I think, is still much harder to evaluate because we're kind of dealing with fairly high-level surveys. I think a lot more could be done. And you see in the private sector, a number of the universities there, such as Bond, actually do a lot better than the public universities. And that's because they are very much focused on teaching. And their whole ethos from the start has been around teaching. They're financially dependent on the fees that students pay. And therefore, that dominates the way they go about it. Whereas in the public universities, they're multi-mission institutions that don't have that focus.
What about international comparisons? I mean, if you go to a US university, a British university, they're sort of the usual ones you look to. Is the teaching experience better?
So where we've got comparable questions in surveys between countries, that they are more positive, typically in Britain or in the US. It's not necessarily that radical, but there is a difference. There might be some student characteristics in the sense that we are bigger on part-time study and mature age study than, say, the UK is. So maybe you've got students who are less connected with the institution. But I think generally speaking, our teaching ethos is a bit below what it is, particularly the US, where like you'll see in some of the surveys of American academics that they see the personal development of their students as one of their responsibilities.
Right.
Whereas in Australia, if an academic can remember your name, you say, well, that's pretty good, let alone, develop you as a person.
So universities in 2023 face significant challenges. Obviously, the impact of COVID-19 shutting out international students and the fact that all courses basically had to go online for 2 years. They were immediate challenges. But there's been a lot of criticism of universities, particularly from the right of the political spectrum, that there is too much cancel culture, there's too much wokeness, that university academic environment is quite authoritarian in some respects. So there's a approved view of how the world works, and then there's the unapproved, the view that is unacceptable, and there's no space on campus for people with differing views. Do you think those accusations have any merit? And if so, what can be done about them?
So obviously there are at least some hot button issues where if you say things too far outside the consensus, you are in trouble. Probably still leaves most topics where people aren't sufficiently politically engaged with it that they're going to even be interested in what you're doing, let alone trying to stop you doing it. I think what has happened over time is that there are fewer and fewer academics who would identify as conservative or liberal or right of centre in any respect. I think this is partly self-selection, that the kind of people who might have taken those jobs decide this is not a particularly congenial environment and simply, and therefore, people don't do their PhDs and all these other things that would have got them to that space. I think it's actually bad for both sides that this has developed. It kind of means that some of the work within the institutions is probably not as aware or as good as it could be if there was more internal challenge to their views. And in some respects, it may have disconnected the conservative intellectual movement from higher education in ways that are bad for it as well. Taking more populist paths when it could be a more reflective approach might have been better.
But is this a new phenomenon, or, I mean, my sort of sense is universities have generally been pretty left-leaning, well, at least my whole lifetime of 43 years. But, I mean, in the 1950s, were universities a bit more either or?
I think they were, but as far as I can tell from the research I've done on this, sort of the turning point is the 1930s and the Depression, which actually radicalised people. And even up until the 1970s, I think the Patrick O'Brien book on the left sort of noticed that at that time there were still slums in Carlton, near Melbourne University. And I think middle-class students coming from Camberwell and Kew were actually shocked by this terrible squalor. And that was radicalising. And then in the 60s and 70s, I think the Vietnam War was also radicalising, that saying you're going to send young people off to be killed in a war they don't believe in is not exactly a winning proposition if you're trying to persuade young people. And so I think there are a whole series of events. But on some of the polls that I've seen, I think even by the 1970s, it's pretty clear that most academics are on the left. But you still get 15 or 20% of academics at that time saying that they are liberal voters.
In terms of the funding arrangements for universities, and I mean, we were just talking before about them being heavily reliant on international student income, Is that going to be a workable model for the future? I know there's another accord being negotiated at the moment between the federal government and the universities. There's obviously funding is ripe for discussion at the moment, and lots of vice-chancellors will have different views on the best way forward. The government, of course, has to navigate the interests of universities, but also what's politically popular too. And as you were saying earlier, universities aren't necessarily huge vote winners for someone in a marginal seat, campaigning in a marginal seat. Where's this going to land? Where do you think is the best place for it to land?
Look, I don't think this accord will kind of be the transformative thing that universities are hoping, because if you look back through history in Australian higher education, at least at the start of all the major reforms, there's money in the bank. So the budget's in reasonable shape, and we don't have that now.
No.
There's no real prospect that we will have that situation in the near term.
Yeah.
So I think that is going to constrain what any government can do. And therefore, non-government revenue sources will still be extremely important for the foreseeable future. International education will probably go up and down. If the current government tightens migration, as it might, that will be a negative for it. On the other hand, I think there is a huge Asian and Indian middle class, and there will still be demand for Australian higher education, even if it's not quite at the scale that was prior to COVID.
And we need to reflect on the importance of what international education has done for multicultural Australia. We've seen waves of migration throughout the last 200 years, but particularly the last 100 or so years, with British, Irish migration, followed by the European migration, the Southeast Asian, Middle East migration, and then now the sort of East Asian, North Asian migration. Finally, I think what we're experiencing now is the South Asian migration, and that all is part of the colour and light of our community. And we've got all these really bright South Asian kids coming to Australia who are fantastic skills that they're bringing and developing in tech sectors, I think medical sectors, and incredibly hardworking. That's, I think, in the end, it's a net positive for the place that Australia is. And also fantastic feedback on what the international community thinks of Australia, that it's a place to aspire to, that you actually want to send your kids to live here and permanently live here, that it's a place that has a wonderful quality of life.
Well, we've been importing skills since 1788.
Yes.
And we're now doing it on a very grand scale. Both a combination of people who come here to study and stay, and those who migrate already having a degree from an overseas university.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. It's been a fascinating discussion on higher education policy, something that is so incredibly important, not just for those attending the university, but for the broader community. So I've really enjoyed it. I really appreciate it. That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.